Game studios. You know them, you love them, you hate them, you skate them. Game studio names are just as recognizable as the games themselves a lot of the time, and in many cases, you can know what to expect from a particular studio before you even play the game. When you crack open a Rockstar game, you know what to expect. Open worlds, freedom, tailing missions.
All we had to do was follow the damn train, CJ!
That kind of thing. You dip your toes into a FromSoft game and you know what you're going to get. An ass whooping. You boot up a Bethesda game and you know you're getting a fun game filled with bugs just aching to be fixed by the modding community within a few weeks.
Stop! You violated the law. Pay the court a fine or serve your sentence. Your stolen goods are now forfeit.
Sometimes, though, what you expect from a studio can change drastically over time. Nowadays, people hear Naughty Dog and think Uncharted and The Last of Us, but back in the day it would make you think Crash Bandicoot or Jak and Daxter. Other times, you can count on entries in classic series from studios that have stuck to their guns and continue to work on the same IP for years or decades, like id with Wolfenstein and Doom. Polishing and refining their babies and keeping up with the times, not letting the property gather dust for too long. But on the flip side, you might have first-party studio-publisher combos like Nintendo or Konami churning out games in these huge franchises for decades, but keeping developers on a short leash and not exactly innovating enough sometimes. But what I want to talk about today is the games that came before the big hitters from various studios and how they influenced the games that put their companies on the map. First up is Rocksteady Studios, the talent behind some of my personal favorites, the Batman Arkham series. Founded in 2004 by former employees of Argonaut Games, a studio that worked on the original 2 Star Fox games, those weird Harry Potter games on the original PlayStation, and iNinja, a game I had entirely forgotten about until I was researching for this video. They also made Croc, which means in some way, shape, or form they're responsible for this clip.
I was playing Croc and I saw the little characters in cages, and frankly I thought, that looks not so bad.
And for that I'll be forever grateful. A couple years after forming Rocksteady, the studio released Urban Chaos Riot Response, a first-person shooter where you play as a cop gunning down hundreds of Jason cosplayers at a horror convention. Soon after, their parent company Eidos secured the rights to make a Batman game, and Rocksteady pitched their take on how they'd approach making a game with the IP, and were given the green light. This led to the trilogy of Batman Arkham Asylum, followed by Batman Arkham City and Batman Arkham Knight. The studio is now finishing up work on Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and rumors have been floating around that they're beginning production on Colon Game, Subtitle. That's a terrible joke, I'm not sorry for it though. The source of inspirations or influences here are a little bit less clear-cut than other examples I'll get to later, but if you roll back the clock a little bit before Rocksteady was Rocksteady and take a look at Argonaut, things start to make a little bit more sense. Argonaut had worked with making games for licensed IPs in the past, with games like The Emperor's New Groove and those Harry Potter games I mentioned, but what I think laid the groundwork for the Batman games was the video game adaptation of the 2004 blockbuster smash hit Catwoman. Now, obviously this game was based off of a critically acclaimed movie, which also coincidentally happened to be a DC Comics IP, but in terms of gameplay and design elements, you can see where it might have influenced the Batman games, with third-person platforming and puzzle solving, and even a points-based combat system that encouraged combos and special moves with unlockable upgrades for even fancier, flashier moves, all of which show up in the Arkham series. Now, I'm not super clear on how many employees that worked on the Catwoman game survived the transition from Argonaut closing to Rocksteady opening, but I'd bet this definitely played a part in influencing their pitch for the Batman game to Eidos. So if you're a fan of the Batman Arkham series, thank Halle Berry. Overall, I think it's neat that this is a studio that was given an opportunity and took the chance to do it right, and now have a reputation built on the success of the chance they were given, with the Batman Arkham series being critically acclaimed. Definitely a lesson to be learned there, but they also have a reputation of sexual harassment, so maybe that rock ain't so steady. Definitely a more important lesson to be learned from that part: don't sexually harass people. Moving on. Insomniac Games formed in 1994, and after some naming struggles, they hit the ground running. Their first game, much like a lot of developers that formed in the early 90s, was a Doom clone. Originally developed for the Panasonic 3DO, but shifted to the OG PlayStation at the last second, was Disruptor. The game did well critically, if not financially, even getting praise from the founder of id Software himself. You know, you must have done something right when your Doom clone gets praised by Doom Guy himself. Not that one. This one. After the not-so-great sales of Disruptor, the team wanted to shake things up and make something new, eventually leading to the gem that is Spyro the Dragon. The team was encouraged by their producers to make something more family-friendly and marketable with an identifiable mascot to compete with games like Super Mario 64, which led to the titular character in the open-world style. After a 3-year, 3-game run, Insomniac decided to move on from Spyro and make something new rather than trying to continue cranking out Spyro games. Around this time was the release of the PlayStation 2, and Insomniac spent some time smacking around ideas for their first game on the console, workshopping an idea for a game called Monster Night that never really got off the ground, and even spending a few months working on a game called Girl with the Stick, a game that was inspired by Zelda and Tomb Raider but with a more serious tone than Spyro, trying to appeal to maybe a slightly older audience. After scrapping that idea, the team started working on a sci-fi themed game about a reptilian alien traveling through space. The character design shifted from reptilian to a caveman and to this little guy eventually. Look familiar? Ratchet & Clank took inspiration from Spyro and Conker's Bad Fur Day, but wanted to change things up by adding more shooting and role-playing elements, leading to Insomniac upping their arsenal in the games that we've all come to know and love. Early on in production, the team didn't even have a suitable game engine to actually make a functional demo to pitch the game with, but managed to secure funding anyway just on the concept, and relent the engine used for Jak and Daxter by Naughty Dog to help create the game, which I think is a neat connection between two major game series from my childhood. Insomniac spent a few years on Ratchet & Clank, branching off and developing the Resistance series alongside it after Deadlocked. Eventually, after a few entries in both series, they got a little experimental with games like Fuse and Sunset Overdrive, which personally I think was rad as hell, basically a skateboarding game with no skateboards. Personally, I think this is where Insomniac realized one of their greatest strengths was in making fun mobility options that make their games enjoyable to navigate, from Spyro's gliding, which was revolutionary at the time, to things in Ratchet & Clank like swinging and grinding and bouncing that all showed up in Sunset Overdrive and were cranked up to 11. After Sunset Overdrive, Insomniac struck gold with Spider-Man, which was headed up by the producer of Sunset Overdrive as the creative director. Insomniac was given free choice of any Marvel character to use for a game, but I believe Insomniac's history with fun mobility in their games led to Spider-Man being the natural choice. Aside from all the memorable characters and guns throughout their track record, I think one of their greatest skills has been making games that are just fun to explore and navigate. And with Spider-Man 2 on the way, I think we have a lot more of that to look forward to. Who knows what they're going to do with that Wolverine game, though? Maybe some wall climbing with his claws or a motorcycle to ride around on. I'm excited to see what they do either way. Last but not least, we have Bungie. You might know these guys from a little first-person shooter that was moderately popular. I'm talking, of course, about Destiny 1. Founded back in the dark ages of 1991 by Alex Seropian, who shortly brought on lead programmer Jason Jones, Bungie didn't jump right into throwing around Master Chiefs and tinkering on Dinklebots. There was a long period of experimentation in the early days of Bungie, but after they hit their stride, it's easy to put together the puzzle of how Bungie got to the point of making the games they're known for. Technically, the first game attributed to Bungie was a solo project by Alex before formally starting the company, which was a straight-up Pong clone called, and this is real, NOP. As an official company, though, they started with top-down tank shooters and role-playing dungeon crawlers, which included the company's first competitive multiplayer mode. Bungie's first FPS, though, was a game called Pathways into Darkness, a game originally intended to be a sequel to their previous role-playing game Minotaur, but over time it evolved into a Wolfenstein 3D-like dungeon crawler focused on exploration with the occasional spooky monster demon boy trying to murder you. Next, starting out as a sequel to Pathways into Darkness, but eventually evolving into its own game, was Marathon, a game that introduced and popularized both rocket jumping and the ability to, brace yourselves here, look up and down. Following these groundbreaking strides in game development and the success of Marathon, Bungie moved on to Marathon 2, which introduced co-op to Bungie's FPS games, so thank Marathon 2 for letting you rock shit as Arbiter, who is, and this is true, a badass. Bungie also made a handful of strategy games in the Myth series, which allowed them to expand and open a second studio, which made one game and then promptly closed. While the second studio was working on that game, the main studio had begun work on Halo, which was originally intended to be a third-person game, which is weird, right? Up until about Y2K, Bungie was tight with Apple and Mac, making games almost exclusively for their operating systems, aside from a few releases on Windows like Marathon 2 and the Myth games. Which is why in 1999 at the Macworld Expo, Steve Jobs himself unveiled Halo Combat Evolved.
And so I'm very happy to welcome on the stage Jason Jones, who is the co-founder of Bungie and the Halo project lead. Halo is the name of this game, and we're going to see for the first time Halo. Welcome, Jason.
Microsoft liked what they saw and snatched up the studio faster than I snatch up chips when I drop them on the ground before my dog eats them. Obviously this was a good move because Halo absolutely popped off, selling more than 6 million copies and becoming the flagship franchise of Xbox faster than you could super combine a grunt. Looking at Bungie's track record, you're able to see points where they experimented with new ideas and technologies at the time, being on the cutting edge of online multiplayer and first-person games, implementing co-op campaigns only a few years after it was brought to the mainstream by Doom, and constantly innovating. It's easy to see how all those pieces come together to result in Halo, and it's easy to see why people ate it up and asked for more as soon as possible. For 10 years, Bungie pumped out Halo games left and right, the main trilogy, ODST, Reach, basically a game every other year that all made bank. Eventually, though, Bungie hung up their Halo hat and decided to move on to Destiny. But Microsoft still owned the rights to Halo and didn't want to give up their flagship property, which led to the creation of 343 Industries, which took up the mantle. Bungie went on to release Destiny in 2014, followed by Destiny 2 in 2017, and by this point it's obvious that Bungie is more comfortable using MMO and RPG mechanics in their games, but the foundation of the game is the solid FPS gameplay and multiplayer fun times that you can seemingly always count on from Bungie. So that brings us to modern day, the future, 20XX. Bungie spent 10 years making games before Halo and spent 10 years with Halo. Sometimes it takes a bit to hit your stride, and even after that, someone already successful might still want to stretch their legs and make something new after a while, rather than spin their wheels or have what they're making get stale. Video games are an art form after all, and most artists will eventually want to go back to making something new and interesting to them, even if they have a safe bet in sticking with what they're known for. Destiny will probably be Bungie's baby for years to come, but at this point it's easy to see where Bungie figured out what they were good at and what they wanted to do and made something that kind of fit right in that sweet spot. And that's the little Destiny baby, little baby Destiny. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's pretty interesting to look at the games that came before big hitters from certain studios. It definitely lets you see influences and experience with certain mechanics in past games and things that the studio might have toyed with a little bit or enjoyed doing and wanted to expand upon or make a more central mechanic of a game. And this definitely leads to studios having certain areas of expertise or talents that you can start to expect or count on with their games. Although maybe keep expectations in check sometimes because it doesn't always pan out. Sometimes even good studios drop the ball. But just treat this as a lesson that practice makes perfect. Sometimes you gotta find what you're good at and hone that skill with your art, your work, anything. I think any creator has an individual style and talent that suits them, and that still applies when you have a lot of people put their noggins together and work on something in a studio. Studios develop that same kind of unique style and approach that sets them apart, and I think that's part of what makes games great. There's something for everyone because everyone's individual tastes and preferences in games. I can guarantee you there's a studio that's making games that check all your boxes. Whether it's a big AAA studio or a small indie team, there's someone making something for everyone. And I think that's pretty rad. Thanks for checking out my video. It's my very first one of hopefully many. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, all the usual stuff. Spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your parents, tell your pets. Help me out, and I'll definitely keep making more of these if this does well. The idea is to make the kind of videos that I enjoy watching and the kind of content that I consume in my free time, which is video essays and stuff of that nature. So I definitely plan on continuing this if this gets any kind of traction. So, like I said, if you enjoyed it, spread the word, help me out, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Love you. Bye.